The Story of Trains. As you listen to the story, try reading along in your own book. When you hear this sound, turn the page. Chapter 1. Early Engines. Hundreds of years ago, it was hard to travel from place to place. Most people walked or rode on horses. If they needed to go a long way, as far as the next town or beyond, they took a carriage.
Hop in!
But taking a carriage was dangerous. The roads were full of highwaymen, lying in wait to attack. Every passenger rode in fear of the dreaded words,
"Your money or your life." Gee up, Dobbin!
Merchants didn't risk carriages. They used barges and sent their goods by canals. The problem with barges was their speed. It was slow. Some took weeks to travel from one city to the next.
We need a fast, cheap, and safe way to travel,
people cried. And then they thought,
tracks!
Since Roman times, every cart driver knew his cart ran more smoothly if it followed the tracks made by other carts.
Keep in the groove, Brutus!
But horses were pulling very heavy loads. Even using the tracks, it was hard to pull a wagon full of coal or iron. Then one day, a group of coal miners had a great idea.
What about building iron rails for our wagons to run on? I like it.
The rails were a huge success. But now the horses had to walk on rails, and that was tricky. What was needed was an engine. In 1712, an English blacksmith invented one. It worked using steam, only it couldn't pull a wagon, so it didn't help much. Almost 100 years later, Richard Trevithick had the answer. Excitedly, he attached his engine to 5 wagons full of people. Everyone waited to see what would happen. Slowly but surely, the engine pulled the wagons along the rails. Richard Trevithick had invented the train.
We're moving!
In 1808, Trevithick built a round track in London. People paid to ride in a coach pulled by his engine. It was the very first train for paying passengers. That looks fun!
But where does it get you?
By the 1820s, engineers all over Europe were building moving steam engines.
This beats horsepower!
Some had metal teeth on their wheels, which fitted into grooves in the track. Others had large wheels, which were connected by metal rods, but none of them ran especially well. So, a competition was held to test different engines. Vast crowds cheered the entrants, but only 3 reached the final. There was the Novelty, which kept breaking down, the Sans Péril, which broke down after 8 trips, and the Rocket, which won. George Stephenson and his son Robert, builders of the Rocket, were thrilled. George had already set up the first public rail service. It took passengers between Stockton and Darlington in northern England. Soon the Stephensons had a factory building more engines just like the prize-winning Rocket. They became very successful, sending their engines all over the world. The rail companies made most money from carrying goods, so engineers put on their thinking caps and designed wagons to carry hay, horses.
Where am I going now?
And heavy barrels. They designed different carriages for people, too.
I hope I packed my spare bonnet.
Did you bring the smelling salts?
The rich went first class, in a splendid carriage with windows and deep, soft seats. In second class, passengers only had a hard wooden seat, but at least they had a roof over their heads. The poorest passengers went third class. They had no roof, and often no seats, but it was quicker than walking.
Hey, my hat!
Chapter 2. Making Tracks. In no time at all, people were going railway crazy, laying rails all over Europe and North America. Rich men got together, raising money to build tracks. Engineers planned the best routes, and the builders set to work. They spread stones on the ground, laid wooden sleepers over the stones, and fitted the rails in place. When the track was finished, the rail company threw a party for everyone who had helped. In America, people called the new tracks railroads. Their dream was for a railroad to cross the entire country. In 1862, two teams of builders began work, one in the east and one in the west. For 7 years, they laid rail after rail until they finally met in Utah.
Nice to meet you at last.
Once the railroad was finished, thousands of people went west to build farms on the open plains. As they moved, they drove Native Americans from their hunting grounds. The American West would never be the same. But the rail companies had other things on their minds. Every time a train met a hill or curve, it came off the track.
This is hopeless,
cried the rail bosses to the engineers. Sort it! So they did, by inventing the bogie. Fixed under a train's engine, the bogie could swivel from side to side, gently leading the train around curves in the track. Then came a bigger worry. American engines burned wood, and sparks flew from their chimneys, setting passengers on fire. Engineers had to build giant chimneys to catch the sparks. They also fixed cow catchers to the front of trains to push stray animals out of the way. Back in Britain, rail companies faced a different problem. Engineers were using two kinds of track. Most had the rails fairly close together, but some tracks were wider apart. Each track needed a different train.
All change!
When the two tracks met, passengers had no choice. They had to get out and change trains. Engineers argued for 50 years before they finally agreed to use the narrower tracks. Then came the biggest problem of all. So many trains were running at once that they started to crash. Signalmen had to hold up flags to warn drivers if the track was busy. Wooden signals soon replaced the flags, and by 1850, all the signals were worked from signal boxes. 10 years later, signalmen used electric telegraph machines to tell each other if a train was coming. Signalmen could also move sections of rail at certain points to let trains move from one track to another.
Neat change.
The signalman pulled a lever in his signal box, the track shifted, and the train puffed off in a new direction. Chapter 3. New Challenges. More difficulties were around the corner, and some were as big as mountains. A mountain range called the Alps blocked the path of any trains trying to cross Europe. Starting on either side, teams of workmen began to dig. They used picks, dynamite, and powerful drills to blast through the rock. For 14 years, the workmen dug and bored, and blasted and dug until
We've made it!
the two sides of the tunnel joined. Between 1857 and 1922, 5 tunnels were built under the Alps. Engineers were even trying to build tunnels under rivers. The tunnel under the River Severn, joining England and Wales, took over 10 years to build and flooded 5 times before it was finished.
Here's the train at last, only 12 years late.
In some places, engineers decided to build bridges instead. If there was plenty of wood around, they built wooden bridges. The only trouble was, wood could rot and crumble. For some creatures, it was also a tasty snack. In India, several bridges collapsed when ants ate through the wood. The strongest bridges were made from steel. The Forth Bridge in Scotland, which is over a mile wide, was made from steel tubes. First, workmen built 3 huge piers in the river. Then they joined the piers together. The first train ran across the bridge in 1890. At last, the railways in Europe and North America were running smoothly, and other countries noticed.
I want a railway to link the cities of Moscow and Vladivostok,
Declared the ruler of Russia in 1891. The track would have to stretch for 6,000 miles across icy plains and mountains, deep lakes, rivers, and bogs. It was another 10 years before the first train could begin the long journey. On the way, the train met a large lake. As the lake was too wide for a bridge, a ferry carried the train to the other side. This plan worked well until winter, when the lake froze solid.
Aha!
Cried the engineers, and quickly laid rails over the ice. But before the first train was even halfway across, the ice cracked, and the train plunged into freezing water. Engineers had to build tracks around the lake instead. It took another 3 years before trains could cross Russia safely, and only the most powerful could make the long, bitterly cold journey. Trains weren't only going over lakes and under rivers. In London, where the streets were clogged with people and traffic, they were going underground. First, builders dug a vast hole in the street and put a roof over the top. They covered the roof with the earth they had just dug up and then rebuilt the street on top. Of course, while they dug, the streets couldn't be used until Henry Greathead, an engineer, came up with the answer. He invented a metal tube that let the builders work underground. The first section of underground anywhere in the world opened in London in 1863. With trains running everywhere, architects designed amazing stations for them. Some could have been mistaken for cathedrals or palaces. Many had huge arching roofs of glass and metal, and underground stations in Moscow were so grand they looked like ballrooms. Chapter 4. Riding in Style. By 1850, thousands of people were using trains. This gave an American furniture maker, George Pullman, a great idea.
Why not make a train more like a home?
Before long, Pullman carriages were everywhere. During the day, the carriages had soft seats and wide corridors so the passengers could walk around.
I've never been on a train before.
At night, bunk beds folded down from above the seats. Even the seats themselves could be turned into beds. Thick curtains kept the beds private.
Wake me up in Paris.
I expect you'll hear the guard. Sweet dreams.
Now that carriages were so comfortable, it became very fashionable to travel by rail. Kings, queens, and presidents all rode in trains, and in 1869, a royal train was built for the British Queen Victoria. Unlike earlier trains, Queen Victoria's even had a toilet on board. It was only the start. In 1872, Georges Nagelmakers, a Belgian, began a company to run luxury trains across Europe. His most famous train was the Orient Express, and it ran all the way from France to Turkey. The Orient Express had splendid compartments and even a library. At night, servants made the seats into beds with silk sheets. It was so luxurious that passengers paid a fortune for tickets. Other companies joined in, offering every kind of carriage. People sat in comfortable compartments or relaxed in saloon cars. Some families booked a whole car just for themselves. Best of all, people could buy food and drink. On the earliest trains, hungry passengers had to eat a quick meal at a station while the train waited for them.
Just wait till I tell my friends I ate on the train. What's your tea?
Now trains had dining cars. things were much better, except when the train went over a bumpy track and food spilled everywhere. If you couldn't afford an expensive ride, you could go on excursion trains. These took people on cheap trips from towns to the country or the seaside for a day. Chapter 5. Faster and Faster. As train journeys became more popular, inventors began to try out different engines. This made the steam engines panic and try to build even faster steam engines. In the 1930s, an engineer named Greasley built the Mallard, the fastest steam engine ever. The front was smooth, so the wind would rush over it. But steam engines already had a rival. In 1892, Dr. Rudolf Diesel of Germany had invented an engine that burned oil. Not only was it cheap and easy to run, it was also very fast. In 1939, a diesel train called the Flying Hamburger set a new world record for speed. Gradually, diesel trains replaced steam engines. By 1965, most trains in America and Europe were diesels. The fastest trains in the world aren't diesels, though. They are electric. The very first electric engine was built by Werner von Siemens in 1879. He proudly showed it off at an exhibition in Berlin, Germany. Even though his engine was small, it easily carried over 20 people. After the Second World War, when lots of tracks had been destroyed, new ones were built, especially for electric trains. They went so fast that people used them to go to and from work every day, even if they lived far away from their jobs.
Here we go again.
I hope I get a seat.
Today, 3 kinds of train can travel at over 300 kilometers, 200 miles an hour. The first in Japan is shaped like a bullet and carries 115 million people across the country each year.
I haven't finished Chapter 1, and we're nearly in Tokyo.
In Germany or China, you can take a maglev train that floats above the rails. Maglev trains are pulled along by magnets, with no noise or smoke at all. And in France, you can ride on the TGV, the fastest passenger train in the world so far. Chapter 6. On the Job. Trains are used all over the world for all kinds of jobs. Many countries use vast freight trains to carry goods. One freight train in South Africa was over 600 wagons long. Freight trains often take their loads all the way to the docks, where the crates are lifted straight onto ships. Sometimes the backs of whole trucks are loaded onto a freight train. The train gives the trucks a piggyback ride to a station where they are fixed to a truck engine and driven the rest of the way. In hilly countries, trains have been designed to carry people up slopes. In 1870, a Swiss engineer built a railway up a mountain. He put a third rail down the middle of the track and added a third wheel under the train. This gave the train an extra strong grip as it went up and down. Funiculars can crawl up even steeper slopes. 2 carriages are fixed to a loop of metal cable, worked by steam or electricity. The weight of the carriage going down the slope helps to pull the other carriage up.
This funicular is spectacular.
I'm out of breath just watching.
There are even trains designed to help other trains by keeping rail tracks clean and safe. Ballast cleaners clean the stones under the track. Rail cranes pick up obstacles. And snow blowers clear snow off the line. But most trains today carry people. And, just like 200 years ago, people want faster travel.
This is like a roller coaster.
So trains have been invented that tilt as they go around corners. Other trains have to slow down as they come to a bend or a curve. Tilting trains barely pause. There are even some passenger trains that are run by computers. They don't have a driver at all.
Who's in charge?
Trains have come a long way since Richard Trevithick's engine, which he named Catch Me Who Can, took people around and around in a circle.